Hello, everybody. Recently, I've been thinking about Lord of the Rings. I'm not sure if that's because The Rings of Power has recently just come out and I desperately want something Tolkien related. So, I was thinking about Lord of the Rings and I had a fun thought experiment that I thought would be fun to share with you guys. So, my thought experiment is if I was transported back into the Lord of the Rings or transported into, a D&D style fantasy, what would be the best weapon loadout to have? I thought of a giant greatsword, a sword that reached all the way up to my chin, you know. I was like, yes, swords are awesome. I definitely want to bring a sword, and the bigger the sword, the better. Incredible, right? Like if I'm going to be fighting goblins, I want to be able to just go through 12 of them at a time, big sweeping attacks. That's the way to go. Then I started thinking about it more. What are some of the things that you'd actually be doing in this fantasy environment? So I made a list. What are some of the things that you do? All right, we're going to be walking, potentially running, horseback riding, walking some more, tons of walking, maybe some camping, clearing some brush. You may be going to a tavern, an inn, going through some sort of town, right? Overall, general traveling. So I was like, okay, ease of carry is going to be important. I was like, okay, what else is important, right? Ease of carry is one. Another thing is lethality. How good is it in combat, right? Like you might be killing creatures, right? This could be like non-humanoid creatures like we see a lot in The Witcher, all sorts of crazy beasts. You could also be killing humanoid type creatures, right? This could be actual humans. Could also be things like goblins, orcs, that sort of stuff. So you may get tasked to go on some adventure where you slay creatures, right? But you may also, while you're traveling, get ambushed, right? So it has to help with that. Maybe you'll have some sort of escort mission, or you'll have to bodyguard. But overall, general combat, right? That's the second important characteristic. Another characteristic that's important is going to be adaptability. How well does the sword work in any given situation? Are you going to be able to use it just as well in the woods, as in a field, as in a cave? Um, how well can you adapt it to the enemies that you're fighting? Are your enemies going to be unarmored, armored, right? Are they going to have naturally tough hides? Another thing, right? How important is having a second hand for something, right? Do you need your second hand for climbing, for holding a torch, for grappling, wrestling? Fourth, how well does your sword work with espionage or stealth? How easily can you hide it or conceal it? And then finally, a minor consideration that I probably won't look at too much is the cost. Before we get too far into it, I decided, you know what? Let's just look at each of these, given situations and say what would be better overall, a one-handed sword or a two-handed sword. Again, I'm coming at this with the mindset of I want to, if I'm bringing a sword, I want a giant greatsword. So, for ease of carry, that's going to be a one-handed sword. It's smaller, lighter, easier to carry for sure. But then I thought, hey, what about a scabbard? What about a back scabbard? That could make carrying a giant two-handed sword easier. And while I think that's true, right, if you're actually traveling, going on an adventure, you're probably going to want to bring a pack. You're probably going to want to bring a cloak. So I don't know if maybe you want to bring a shield. So I don't know if a back scabbard actually solves that. Like if you have your sword on your back, where are you putting your backpack? How is your cloak arranged? If you have a shield, where does that go? Right? So I think overall, for ease of carry, one-handed sword is better. When it comes to combat, I would say the two-handed sword has the edge. Right? There's definitely more lethality there, unless you also have a decent amount of armor that you're wearing, or maybe you want to bring a shield, in which case two-handed sword versus sword and shield. It's a toss-up at that point. Which one's better? I still think perhaps the two-handed sword a little bit better, but a one-handed sword, not bad either. when it comes to how adaptive it is, right? Can you fight in big spaces as well as small spaces? Can you fight in different types of terrain? Uh, can you use your second hand for stuff? Again, the one-handed sword seems better. When it comes to stealth, one-handed sword, you're going to be able to hide that better, right? When it comes to cost, again, smaller sword, in theory, less material should cost less. So, when I first started this thought experiment, I thought, okay, big sword is the way to go. After looking at some of the situations, now I'm starting to think, okay, single-handed sword is the way to go. So, looking at different types of single-handed swords, which one would I want to bring? I first thought of a rapier or a small sword. And those are one-handed. Rapiers are quite long, great in a dueling context without armor, but I think the handguard would just be too bulky to carry around. I think the length would actually become a problem in some cases, and it's very hard to attack multiple opponents efficiently with a rapier. Doesn't seem like a great choice, so I'd be out on the rapier. Next thing I was thinking of are, really short swords. Things like the gladius, and historically those were taken on really long journeys, easy carry, super easy. But for that to really be effective, it really does need to be paired with a large shield, right? My hand protection's minimal, the range pretty abysmal. So I actually think gladius is a bad choice. Rapier is a bad choice. Gladius is a bad choice. So my next thought was the Xiphos. And funny enough, we actually see a pretty direct comparison to the Xiphos in Lord of the Rings with Sting. So this is kind of already a Lord of the Rings style sword. Now, if I'm being shoved into Lord of the Rings, I would not. I think Sting would be too small for me. And so the Xiphos has a little bit more hand protection, but not substantial. Again, pretty short blade, so I'd be a pass on that one as well. What about a Chinese style Dao? Pretty good cutter. Thrust probably okay, but I don't know. I'm not loving the amounts of hand protection, so I'd probably be a pass on that. The next thing I thought of was, machete. A great overall tool. If you go to South America, you'll see people, farming with machetes, clearing brush with machetes, and all sorts of crazy stuff with machetes. Fishing with machetes. The thing is a machete, I think the blade overall is too thin to be effective in combat. It can do some okay cuts, but it's short, too floppy in my opinion, and it really has no thrusting power. And if you're gonna be in a sort of fantasy scenario where you're fighting creatures, people with different levels of armor, you're gonna want something that can both cut and thrust, and machete just can't do that. Just wouldn't be the one for me. After taking a look at that, I thought of the Yatagan. The Yatagan has a nice recurve blade. It can be effective in both the thrust and the cut. So overall, I think the Yatagan is an okay choice. Again, a little bit shorter than I would like personally, and not a whole lot of hand protection. So I think it's okay, but it wouldn't be my favorite. If we take a look at sabers, the Shamshir, Tulwar, Killage, I'm kind of grouping all those together because they're all similar styles where they have, some of them will have a D-shaped guard, so it's okay hand protection. They have a curved blade and primarily used for slashing, and depending on the type of Shamshir or Killage, they may be very, very curved, in which case it's very difficult to thrust with those. So actually for that reason, because they're so curved, I would actually probably not take those, despite the fact that the Killage is very awesome, because thrusting I think is going to be important depending on what type of enemy you're facing, and the thrusting abilities on those, despite the fact that they can cut really well, there's just some armors you can't cut through, so you want to be able to thrust. The Falcata I think would be an okay design. You can thrust with them. The point is not exactly in line with your wrist on some of them because of the forward curve, but Cut's great. You can thrust. I think you can thrust easier with the falcata than you can with the killage, for example. And it has okay hand protection, so I think the falcata would be an okay choice. Another choice would be the falchion or the messer. I'm grouping those together. They're pretty similar blade types, and a messer has pretty good hand protection as well. It has the cross guard along with the nail, and again, you can cut with it, you can thrust with it. So I think the messer would be an okay choice, not bad at all. Another interesting choice is the Chinese hook sword. So the Chinese hook sword, pretty interesting. Um, Pretty good hand protection, right? They have those crescent guards, and you can do some pretty crazy stuff with Chinese hook swords. You can, connect the two together, swing them around, do some weird stuff. There's all sorts of like areas that you can offend with on the hook swords, right? Every piece of it is a weapon. The only reason I would say maybe not is because I feel like the hook swords are best used in a fighting pair. So I think that would potentially negate some of the benefits of being able to have an offhand to either hold a torch, use a shield, grapple, do whatever. But I don't think the hook sword is a bad choice. Because if you wanted to have two weapons, you could. If you wanted to just have one and then use the other hand for something else, you probably could. The only thing that I don't love about them is the fact that you can't really thrust with them. You kind of have the back spike, which you could maybe do some stuff with, but yeah. So overall, I think probably an okay choice, but not the one I would go with. Funny enough, we can look at one of the swords from Lord of the Rings, the Uruk-hai sword. It's one-handed. It looks like a beast of a cutter, and it has that big spike on the back. And yeah, I think that would, funny enough, be an okay choice, especially if you're pairing it with a shield like they have. But again, I think despite the fact it has that spike on the back, there's not really a good way to thrust with it aside from that spike. So I'd probably pass on that one. But it's like it's more combat ready version of machete. And we can't forget our favorite arming sword. Good cut and thrust weapon, has an okay amount of hand protection. I think that's a solid choice. So if we're looking at just single-handed swords, then I think we're left with, a falchion or a messer. I think that's a pretty solid one-handed sword choice. Looking at the arming sword, again, I think that's a pretty solid choice. Looking at the falcata, I think a pretty decent choice. Chinese hook sword, maybe. I think those would all be okay. But I thought to myself, what if? What if you had a sword that gave you pretty much all the advantages of a single-handed sword? Right? You could easily use it in one hand, and that way you can use a shield, carry a torch, grapple, do whatever. But in a pinch, you could also put a second hand on it and use it as a two-handed sword and up the lethality. Make it more versatile. I was like, that would be incredible. And I was like, what types of swords are like that? And you know what? It's Boromir's sword. Boromir's hand and a half sword. Oh my goodness! It has the extended pommel, and you see him use it in the Mines of Moria. You see him use it with his shield, and works great. But then you also see him later on in the first movie where he's fighting all by himself and he left his shield. No, Boromir, and it has the extended pommel, so you can easily put the second hand on it, and he can fight with it two-handed. And then if he needs to, he can take the hand off, do some grappling pretty easily. You see him grab the axe of one of the Uruk-hai, and he's also able to use that second hand to grab his horn. So I was like, oh my goodness, it has all the advantages of a single-handed sword, but then it also has a couple of the advantages of a two-handed sword. I'm like, that's incredible. And so I was like, that's the choice right there, Boromir sword. Now, are there other swords that could fall into that category? Funny enough, I actually think, and I know some people have been screaming this the whole time since we started bringing up pictures of swords, what about the katana? What about the katana? Funny enough, even though I would classify it typically as a two-handed sword, it's pretty short, especially for a two-handed sword. It does have an extended handle, but that extended handle gives it some additional balance. And I think it's short enough and light enough that you could actually pretty easily use a katana in one hand. Then if you needed to, you could put two on it. So I actually think katana, funny enough, Okay choice. Not bad. You can cut with it. You can thrust with it. I don't love the amount of hand protection, but yeah, not a bad choice. I thought about, what about the long sword? There are some techniques where you use it one-handed, but primarily it's a two-handed sword, and you're just taking that one hand off for a couple of techniques. But you don't typically, do extended fights with one hand on it. You could in a pinch, but it's not ideal. So yeah, I think the sword I'd go with, Boromir sword, all the way, fantastic sword. And yeah, I think the best adventuring sword, if you were to be transported into a D&D scenario or a Lord of the Rings, the best adventuring sword is Boromir sword. Short enough to where very easy to carry, very versatile. I think you could use it in all terrain types. Um, but when you need to, you can throw that second hand on there. So, boom, best sword for adventuring. That's what I decided. Boromir sword. That's the one. That's the one. All right. Well, um, hopefully you guys had fun in this thought experiment. I certainly did. And yeah, so first piece of gear. Obviously, we want a sword, and yeah, the best sword for that, Boromir sword. Now we know. All right. See you later.